thank you. And thank you all so much for coming. There's so many friendly faces here, young and especially, old and especially young. I got the wrong way around, but I am delighted that you've all come. I'm just going to check. Yeah, okay. So, as Mike said, I started at Sussex in January 2012. And my role was to make real a very important investment that the university's made in the area of childhood and youth studies, which includes undergraduate and postgraduate programs, as well as an interdisciplinary research centre. Much of the hardest work was done before I came by colleagues in education and social work, but also right across the university who collaborated to get these new curricula happening. 2 years on, the programmes are established and the centre is thriving and recently gained the status of a university research centre, which we're really pleased about. Cersei, which is what we call it for short, so you can call it that too, is an inclusive space bringing together childhood and youth researchers from across the university, including the social and natural sciences, professional disciplines of law, social work, education, but also importantly the arts and humanities. And we try and bridge the gap between research and development and take our obligation to innovate seriously, engaging actively in knowledge exchange with practitioners, and our mission is to be interdisciplinary, international and in the real world, which is quite a difficult thing to do, and we work hard and we're getting there in that process. One of the first things that we did when we started was to, all the researchers who had a shared interest in Sarah got together to identify what were the common themes or the synergies between our research. And here on the right, you'll see the kind of headings, which are our main areas, our sort of research themes that we organise our activity together around, so which is a good childhood with a question mark at the end, asking critical questions about what that means, extraordinary children, emotional lives, and the last one is digital childhoods and digital youth, and you get a sense there of what we see that as involving. So my talk today is going to be focusing on the last of those, on digital youth, digital childhood, and I'm going to be drawing very tentatively on a research project that's only been going for 4 months called Face to Face, Tracing the Real and the Mediated in Children's Cultural Worlds. The project's funded by the National Centre for Research Methods and brings together a really fantastic team, most of whom are here this evening. So that's Kate Howland in informatics here at Sussex, Sarah Bragg at the University of Brighton in education, Mary Jane Kahili at the Open University, Sue Sharp and Lucy Hadfield, who are independent researchers, and Esther McGeaney and Liam Berriman, who are also research fellows in Cersei. And we were also working with filmmaker Susie Arnott and photographer Crispin Hughes to help us make multimedia documents around children and young people's lives. And delighted that Susie's here. We're going to be able to see some of that work this evening. Our primary focus for the project is methodological innovation. We're trying to work out how we can use qualitative methods to document what's a fast-changing digital landscape and finding ways of representing things that are open, processual, non-linear, constantly on the move. As well as exploring the potential of these methods, we're very interested in looking at how we can get insights into children's emotional lives as part of this. And the two things that we're doing, we're working with a panel of children who are 7 or 8 years old, and also a group who are between 12 and 15. And the methods we're using include asking them to talk to us about their favourite things and using objects as a way of engaging in interviews and talk, but also day in the life observations. The project was kick-started quite literally by a public engagement project funded by the university called Space Invaders, where young people were invited to make short films about their use of new media. And our aspirations for the project, and having some good conversations with Ros earlier on about how to make this real, are to create a new collection. We're talking with our colleagues at the Mass Observation Archive about the possibility of making an everyday childhood collection that forms part of that really important national resource. But the key to doing that is to think about ways of doing this which are ethical and respectful, but also allow young people to be in the driving seat of the research process and also exercise our duty of care to them as researchers. And as I think as some of the things I'm going to say this evening will show what a complicated terrain that is when we're talking about digital childhoods. Those things are really far from straightforward. Before I get to the substance of the lecture, I want to say something quickly about the kinds of lens we're using in the project. The theme of children in the media is full of anxiety and worry. In the last week, I've followed stories about remote child sexual abuse connecting children in the Philippines with adult audiences in Britain. Reports of an inquest to a teenage girl who was reported to be addicted to self-harming sites, and rising levels of teachers engaging in inappropriate behaviour with students. This is a typical week. As digital technologies are implicated in more and more aspects of everyday life, so they also become ubiquitous features of all news, good and bad. But it can be hard to get beyond a risk-based agenda. We can become fixated or paralysed by these genuine horror stories and unable to think about the ordinary, the everyday and possibly extraordinary ways in which childhood is remade in an era of digital technology. So the research project that we're doing engages in a very much an everyday approach to children's lives. Our way into the subject is through a focus on lived time, capturing the everyday routines and practices that shape a week, a day, a season. This doesn't mean that we're unaware of or not interested in risk, or that we ignore young people's expressions of discomfort, frustration, or their vulnerability. But I believe that in order to think properly about digital childhoods, we need an approach that takes nothing for granted, avoids normative framings, and respects the everyday and the ordinary. Okay, so the first point I want to make is that we are all implicated in this. Technology is both a marker and a driver of change, and our locations in the technological and cultural history mark us as generations, with many of our deepest dispositions and identifications formed in our childhood and our youth. Child development is always a historically contingent affair. If I look at 3 generations of my own family, a recognisable, if unique, picture emerges. My mum grew up in an era of radio, cinema and the post, and she's a letter writer by habit and disposition, although she's adapted well to telephone calls when they were no longer an expensive luxury. Dancing to live music was a feature of her youth, replaced by records in adulthood. Touch typing was a key skill that she used in her working life, taking an early retirement as the word processor transformed the social relations of work. She got a taste for TV in her middle age, and in recent years she's entered the world of broadband and Wi-Fi, driven both by her desire to communicate to far-flung friends who no longer write letters, and the need to access the cheaper tariffs for almost everything that are preserved for those with online access. A new development is a tablet and the opportunity to read books online and watch again on iPlayer, allowing new guilty pleasures such as the ultimate sin of watching TV in bed. I think you have to be born when she was born to see that as the ultimate sin. Yeah. Born in 1966, I've never had any problem with watching TV in bed. I grew up in the TV generation. Swap Shop, Channel 4, The Tube. The telephone and telephone boxes were an important part of my cultural landscape, both as meeting places and as a way of taking on a disguise and talking to strangers. In teenagehood, cassette tapes provided a DIY soundtrack and a way of creating personalised gifts. Most of my dancing was to recorded music, and although increasingly made live by the alchemy of a DJ and a dance floor. My education was fully analogue, and digital technologies only coincided with my entry into work, with email, word processing and computer programs for data analysis and desktop publishing, all providing an exciting and empowering set of tools for democratising knowledge. The Walkman made me, like most of my generation, into a star of my own music video. But increasingly, mobile technologies were disruptive of my sense of autonomy and privacy, which were formed in an earlier era. I struggled to use the computer screen for fun and resisted the idea that my whereabouts and availability might be visible and available to others. And as my colleagues know, I'm still not on the digital diary, and we'll hold out on that one. Parenthood gave me the opportunity to revisit my childhood vicariously in a new era. And as parents, Sean and I indulged ourselves by rewatching our favourite films, TV programmes, music videos, etc., with our son first on video and then quite expensively again on DVD. With time, we began to wonder and worry about how much screen time is too much and when he might deserve some privacy, and then what on earth privacy might look like in these days. So I suppose my son would qualify as a digital native, despite all those wooden toys. He's a touch typist, prefers to multitask, and while not a letter writer, he happily communicates by Skype and phone. He likes free time and online, not just gaming, but also hanging out, chatting while doing his homework, keeping up with his subscriptions, and commenting on content posted by others. He helps his granny with her email, an ever more complicated television, and his mum with her PowerPoint presentations and increasingly her research. As the youngest generation of a family, a child is always the endpoint of a continuous cargo of meaning, resources and feelings that span time and place and connect the living and the long gone. There's a paradoxical relationship between our childhoods, which are both emotionally coterminous, connecting us with each other, and historically divided, defining our differences from each other. I like the account provided by Mannheim, who describes the transition between generations as a continuous yet fragile process, with continuity achieved in the context of flux and renewal, involving both conscious and unconscious mechanisms through which knowledge is transmitted in a form that's condensed or implicit or virtual. So digital childhoods are then part of the wider digital era that includes parenting, work, play, and relationships between generations. We are all digital, even if we are incompetent. The term is also a way of connecting childhoods over time. We have all been children, and the childhoods of our parents and our grandparents are within us in mysterious ways. But the term divides us too, revealing our differences and the limits of our understanding and our authority to navigate experiences that we don't understand and we find threatening. And I think this is something I hope we can hold on to when we're thinking about digital childhoods, because it makes sense of our strong emotional reactions to the subject and locates our contemporary period in a longer historical context. Okay. The second point I wanted to make is that it's very difficult to conceptualize a period when you're in it. Our working theories and our concepts tend to be our expressions of the situation that we're in. Again, I can illustrate this in autobiographical mode with my colleague Janet Holland and others, and Janet is here, which is very lovely. I was involved in a 15-year longitudinal study of young people's lives that began in 1996 called Inventing Adulthood. And we followed 100 young people over 15 years, which was a very foolish thing to do, I think, at some level. It took a lot of our lives to do that. Around 1997, the young people began to come to interviews with mobile phones, and these were very important markers of emerging status and maturity, and especially for young women, they were routes to new kinds of freedoms. But within a year, the same young people were complaining that their younger siblings were getting phones at a much younger age than they had. Before too long, they were beginning to use social media and thought that this might be a way of keeping in touch with friends when they left school, or finding ways of discovering other young people like themselves elsewhere. A couple of years later, social media was completely normalised as young people, and these now young adults explained how their contacts, stored, a new term to us at that point, stored in their phones and their Facebook pages, were a crucial resource for work and career. And we researchers, like everybody else, started relying on social media as a way of keeping in touch with our participants. It was around this time that the terms digital native and digital immigrant were coined, distinguishing those who were born into the digital age from those who had to learn the new skills. And closely aligned to this was the idea of the digital divide that identifies tensions between those two. In workplaces and other institutions, the digital divide upset the generational order, and policies were devised to encourage professionals working with children and young people to either catch up or control the consequences of these invasive technologies. At the same time, another interpretation of the digital divide was also emerging, one that observed socio-economic inequalities in access to material and social and cultural capital, distinguishing between the media rich and the media poor. Digital literacy emerged as another important term in the new millennium, cutting across some of the contradictions of the digital divide. Within education, it provided an agenda for recruiting digitally literate teachers, for an ICT curriculum, and for a way of raising awareness of the unforeseen consequences of internet display and for future reputations, what young people these days will understand as e-safety. So I want to say, so research in this area is always already out of date, as practices change so fast and in very uneven ways. And there's some really interesting sort of online, the Pew Centre, Internet Research Centre has some really interesting interactive models which will show how dynamic the picture is. We have the benefit of some major empirical projects that enable us to understand the dynamic environment on digital media use over time. These include things like Ofcom, the Pew Research Centre, but also the very important new study called Eurokids Online, which is headed by Sonia Livingston, which has been doing the painstaking work of mapping digital lives of 25,000 children across 25 countries. And her findings, her sort of headline findings, are interesting to look at briefly. So her work confirms that access to online media is getting younger and younger. We know that children, young people and teenagers and young adults are the most intensive users of social media, of the internet in general. Many users are underage for the platforms and the apps that they're using, and they don't have the skills to control privacy settings. Yet, importantly, among the 9 to 16-year-olds surveyed in this study, self-reported harm is low. Only 12% report being bothered by something online. And although exposure to mild risk is common, and mild risk is defined as mean comments on Facebook, severe risk is rare, defined as issues around grooming, for example. And the picture of risk that emerges from this work is actually very complicated. So here I'll let you look at that quote yourself. But interestingly, high digital literacy doesn't necessarily protect against risk in a simple way. Risk is higher in wealthier countries with greater press freedom, more broadband, more computers, and more years in schooling. And not surprisingly, children who are vulnerable offline are also vulnerable online. But as this quote shows, there are also new groups who get drawn, who perhaps would not normally be seen as vulnerable, who might become vulnerable in this context. The Eurokids study also found that most kids stick to parental rules, roughly, but also that the nature of parent-child relationships depends on many things, including the speed at which online access is taken up, and the kind of generation gap that exists in particular countries, in particular social class groups within particular countries. So it's very synchronized, very contingent nature of this. Okay, so I want to, if in 2014 these terms such as digital native, digital divide and digital literacy have much less salience than they did in the 90s and the early 2000s. And the latest round of debates suggests that we're moving from an agenda focused on access and literacy to one that seeks to understand the interactions between software and subjectivity and culture. And here I'm just going to go quickly through 4 concepts that we're working with and that are emerging from contemporary research, which I think are kind of key ideas for thinking with. So the first of these is Polymedia, which is offered by the anthropologist Danny Miller, who's doing lots of work in this area. The argument is that the online is now absolutely integral to everyday life, and that we can't really distinguish in the same ways between online and offline. So the key aspects of Polymedia, the idea of Polymedia, is it's enabled by widespread availability of broadband, Wi-Fi, and limitless data contracts. Now, clearly this is not in place for all, but he argues this is the model that we're moving towards. And in the context where access is unlimited, then choice becomes important. And he describes this environment as one in which people are free to choose between several equally available forms of media. So therefore, the combination and selection of that media really starts to matter. The second idea or concept for thinking with I want to offer is affordances. This is a term that comes from the field of design and human-computer interaction and concerns the quality of an object or an environment which allows an individual to perform an action. In the same way, platforms and applications give rise to particular logics of practice. So US researcher Dana Boyd has written about Facebook as having an architecture of ratings and comparisons. And Lanier writes about the software designs and business models that facilitate crowd mentalities and anonymity in a way that brings out the inner troll in all of us. So these are the kinds of practices or ways of acting and thinking that seem to be incited by the software itself. And an interesting recent example comes from the work of Jessica Ringrose and colleagues on sexting, who write about the affordances of persistence, of manipulation and uncertain audiences, which are associated with the combination of the camera and social media technologies together. When circulated in a peer group, a sexualized image becomes a cipher for sexual reputation, and what was potentially an intimate gesture, consensually shared, also becomes potentially dangerous, exposing someone to judgment and ridicule through practices of rating and boastings. Obviously, there's continuities with the past there, but it's made new with particular kind of technology. Technologies and applications then get inside us, but they can also be understood as producing forms of governance and self-governance. And many scholars continue to build on Foucault's idea of technologies of the self to explore the consequences of our engagement with social media. So Alice Marwick, for example, writes about the Web 2.0, so that's the interactive web, as a neoliberal technology of subjectivity, a blueprint for how to prosper in a society where status is predicated on a cultural logic of celebrity. And she talks about the idea of an attention economy, an economy built around the idea of attention. But we can also get inside technologies, combining and reusing them in new and unanticipated ways. And I think that's something that there's less research about, but I think that is certainly an important part of the project that we're working on at the moment. So the fourth idea is value. In the tradition of cultural sociology, we understand cultural capital as something that can be held and translated into economic capital, economic advantage. And debates about the media-rich and media-poor communities and households have been informed by this approach. But we're beginning to see a more sort of dynamic language of value that's beginning to emerge from debates within sort of feminist and media studies. So people like Beverly Skeggs, Helen Woods, Imogen Tyler, who are looking at things like reality television and exploring how these kind of forms of media may feed from their human subjects. I mean, literally feed, that's why I'm giving you the matrix. And how this value then moves around in the viewing and the afterlife of these programs via social media. Again, this is a theme that's taken up by Jessica Ringrose and her colleagues in their work on sexting, asking important questions about the sharing and circulation of these sexually explicit images, asking why are the images valuable, who do they create value for, and who can they devalue? All of these really important questions for research in this area. In a cultural environment in which it's assumed that content is free, value then is created by logics of advertising, perhaps, building an audience and realising them in other ways, which is central to the kind of YouTuber dream career, but also through an economy of scarcity. So that's when the material, the limited edition becomes a way of holding value. But the underlying this model of value is the consequences of, it's all about the participation. Facebook only has value if it's populated and used by members. YouTube has become what it is through the free labour and the creative contribution of millions of YouTubers posting content. So it's only through the labour of users that the affordances of technologies are realised and value is created. If we join together ideas of value, affordances and polymedia, we may both think about our contemporary digital culture as poised between a dystopia as represented by the Matrix, where we are the batteries, both producing and consuming, and a utopian vision of possibility and play, which are constrained but not yet determined, spaces where anything might happen. Okay, so I'm going to now talk a little bit about some of the emergent ideas that are coming from our research, face-to-face project. I want to begin with the idea of digital temporalities. Social and online media are increasingly embedded in the routines and rhythms of young people's everyday lives, from browsing Twitter feeds at the breakfast table through to browsing at the breakfast table to sending goodnight messages to friends before bed or in bed. Media activities increasingly contribute to the delineation of different periods and moments of daily life. One of the key points to emerge from our pilot interviews are the ways in which the temporal fabric of young people's daily lives are mediated in and through the affordances of technologies. So here we see kind of on the left a kind of a typical kind of routine, daily routine for a 14-year-old. In the morning, an intense period of checking in and coordination of homework, how to get to school, what's happening, using things like WhatsApp, Facebook and Twitter. Then, interestingly, a pause, which is the day at school, before getting home, updating and documenting the day, again, through things like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and then a multitasking early evening period of homework and treats, where they might be on a combination of the educational Moodle alongside Steam, Skype, YouTube. The pause again, that is dinner and family time, maybe watching some TV with parents, and then bedtime, difficulties of stopping, signing off at night, again, intense activity late at night. We're really interested in the ways in which this polymedia environment changes the meaning of the face-to-face interactions. A lot of the attention is put onto the online, but we're fascinated by, for instance, the pause represented by school, where young people stop doing this very individualised media practice that we're doing beforehand and do something that's much more kind of much more collective, which involves trying to outwit the school systems, to crack the filters and get games that you're not supposed to, maybe to get your phones out when a supply teacher is in, or perhaps to text underneath the table. But polymedia also changes the ways in which young people hang out with each other, and social contact outside school becomes something that can or must be organised, and social media provides a means of planning and displaying this. So face-to-face events are not simply live, but are documented for others to see, and this means that issues of inclusion and exclusion become really acutely important, as these kind of various different kind of examples of awkwardness from young people document. I should say, I don't know, does anyone know what that picture on the right is? Other than Esther? This is something called the awkward, I bet some of the young people, the awkward turtle. which is really interesting because this is something you do when you're in a situation that's really awkward and you want to signal to other people how uncomfortable it is. And so you do the awkward turtle, which started as an emoticon in texting. So, it was a symbol of awkwardness, which now is something that actually can be done in the real world. So I suppose an example of the traffic between the two and the importance of understanding these two as related and connected to each other. Okay. In her research on cyberbullying, Jette Kofod describes how new technologies, are characterized by non-simultaneity, so things not happening at the same time, in which emotional intensity is postponed, fastened, slowed down, or distorted by interaction with the technology. So acts of cyberbullying are often associated with these delayed responses, such as the offensive comment on Facebook that may not be read until the end of the school day. And something that's beginning to emerge from our research is the creative way in which young people use sound and use sound in order to make synchronicity, to create bridges or forms of togetherness. So I'm just going to, okay, I'm going to go, all right, yeah. But in order to reflect on this, I want to start by talking a bit about a installation by the artist Susan Hiller, which was the picture that you saw at the first slide, which is called Witness. For this work, Hiller collects together oral witness statements of UFO sightings from around the planet. These accounts are broadcast through tiny speakers that hang like branches from the ceiling, and we as participants are invited to move through the space, listening in to a cacophony of voices and languages, one after another, yet always in our own private world. However, the recordings are on a complicated loop, and about once every hour, the babble converges into a single witness statement. And as listeners, we experience the disarming sense that what we are hearing inside our head has moved all around us, connecting us powerfully with our fellow visitors through a sonic bridge, before the witness accounts then drift back into their own temporal sequences for another cycle. Since the invention of the Walkman and the mobile phone, new media technologies have offered us ways of manipulating forms of togetherness and disconnection, transgressing the public and the private. The silent disco, I don't know if anyone's ever been to one, is perhaps the most comic and playful manifestation I've experienced so far, allowing us to prize apart the relationship between physical and aural co-presence. Kate Lacey, who's a scholar here at Sussex, encourages us to notice the differences between listening in a receptive and mediatized form of communicative action, and listening out, which she characterizes as an attentive and anticipatory disposition. And in our research, we become fascinated with how young people use things like Skype to create synchronicity and a sense of community and togetherness. So that multitasking homework time in the early evening is a period when, in the early evening, seems to be a time when young people use the sound affordances of Skype in order to virtually hang out, moving between homework, YouTube, gaming, sometimes playing together, sometimes having the chat of others as just wallpaper to their own work. And like in Susan Hiller's installation, individuals and households come into a single soundscape just for a short time that can be connected or separated from the surrounding environment in unpredictable ways by use of earphones and overheard conversations. And I'm just going to show you a little film about this.
I'm a crumpet.
You're a crumpet. We didn't want to tell you till you were 21, but we decided that now. What? Oh, Snap, is he? One sec, guys.
Damn. At this point, only captures slightly faster. Actually, I don't think it even does capture faster.
It does. Look at the speed on it. It's done.
Yeah, because that's
I got to
Yeah?
Yes?
Okay, one sec.
Yeah, it doesn't go that slowly. Any of the points.
B goes a lot slower than this.
Who's that?
B, yeah, I know.
Exactly. That's why I was saying it captures faster.
Yeah, but I mean, like, A captures about the same. The B is slower.
time to you? Yeah, you're just walking on the street and you accidentally fire your crossbow. As you do. Yeah? Come in.
Okay. Second theme emerging from the research that I want to talk about is the involves young people's relationship to content, the material they create and make visible through social and digital media. What's most exciting to me about digital technologies is the way in which they democratise cultural production. So it's now ordinary for young people to make their own films, music and images and to broadcast these on their own channels. Becoming a YouTuber is a new dream profession of working, not working. And while content is free, most young people think they have absorbed a model through which value can be created, but with complications. One way of creating content is using the self, and at entry level this might be the selfie, the photograph of the self, scaling up into the full-scale daily vlogging where audiences are invited to watch a life as it is lived. One danger of using the visible self in this way is there's nowhere to hide. In the short term, being seen by strangers may not matter very much to young people, as so much young people as being seen by peers, especially if they're presenting a version of the self that is very much in contradiction to that which they might present at school or with family and friends. In the interactive context of social media, the decision to publish is the first rather than the final stage of the creative process. Posting content opens the author up to reactions, likes, ratings and comments, which are also public. Controlling the afterlife of digital content is far from easy, and the desire to create quality content involves experiment, trial and error, so being ignored may be a relief, and gaining followers or subscribers a very slow process. And these quotations from our young informants give a sense of the ethical territory, showing how different kinds of engagement raise very different kinds of issues. Local audiences are potentially the most problematic and the most real, yet given that everyone appears to be doing the same thing, the shame of being seen experimenting may be lessened. The risks of participation can be tempered by various forms of anonymity enabled by digital or media, but these very forms of anonymity also incite the desires and the skills of the amateur detectives of the internet to find and crack the names and addresses behind the internet personas. This is the sociology bit. Love a diagram. So there's a complicated dance between anonymity and display, participation and consumption that I've tried to map on this diagram that shows the different kinds of practices that young people have been reporting to us. This is particularly the sort of 12 to 15-year-olds been report, and it's been mapped along two axes. One axis, and these are the axes that really represent the things that were important to young people, the way that they were describing them. So one is on participation and non-participation, or so activity and passivity, and the other is on visibility and invisibility. And I think it's quite interesting that if you see, is it too small for you to see at the back? So the top left-hand corner up here, we've got the animations let's plays, which is like narrating, capturing what's going on the computer, so particularly with games, talking it through, creation of music, fandom, and fake identity channels, so ways of making stuff which doesn't necessarily mean revealing who you are. So it's high participation but high anonymity. On the other side, on the right, you've got celebrity, being a celebrity, a genuine celebrity, but then being a vlogger, which is allowing your daily life to be recorded, being a YouTuber, so being very visible on YouTube, known as a celebrity, but also using Twitter. Twitter kind of fits in this kind of high participation, low anonymity. Over here we have low participation, high anonymity. That's things like commenting on other people's content, following, liking, lurking and watching, and it's probably this is the most passive, going up to quite active. And over there on the right, it's being tagged in photographs, so it's selfies, sexting and commenting. And each of these kind of sets of activity have got really different kinds of logics and difficulties, perhaps some of the most dangerous or high risk actually are over in this corner over here. Low participation, low anonymity. And over here, this is probably what Sonia Livingston's talking about, is the kind of, over here, the high risk and high participation. Okay. So I just, in order to sort of, I want to leave the last word to young people. I've got some nice things to share with you. I just want to say three things in terms of the implications of this for working with, for those who do professional work or work as volunteers or are parents, those who are in relationships with children and young people. The first is about the way in which we might think or embrace the re-enchanting of face-to-face relationships and encounters. I think from what we're finding is that it's as important, the impact of the digital is as important on face-to-face, and that tends to be neglected. I think we know already there's lots of problems about the impact of the digital in terms of work with children and young people. That might be the ways in which the bureaucratic systems and computer systems divert attention from the face-to-face work, which is something that was raised in the Monroe Review as a real problem, the way in which professional judgment and relationships become marginalised, for instance, in child protection, but also large swathes of youth work, counselling work, have been replaced by phone lines, websites and interactive technologies. There can, of course, be benefits to this, and particularly around anonymity. But too often they are offered as cost-saving alternatives rather than enhancing and enriching. So we need to think about what's special and different about face-to-face interactions and how these might change in a polymedia environment. And we're beginning to do some work really asking people to talk to us about what that is. And I think one of my favourites here is from one of our people we work with at the National Theatre, who does a lot of work with young people, who says live is most exciting when it's a group experience and all have a voice. It's a provocation to action and response. Young people love the shared experience, and that something might go wrong. Seeing how people react, it's higher stakes. And I think it's very important we can think about the provocation of the digital as a way of really thinking about what's exciting and how the live might be changing. The second thing I want to raise here is how important it is to keep the personal in professional identities. And one of the impacts of the way in which digital media collapses boundaries between home and work, between the private and the public, is that professionals have got very anxious about hiding their private lives from children and young people. All the controversies about teachers on Facebook, and the sort of the notion that what makes you professional is the ability to hide the private. Now, I think it's really important for us to know that there's a third term here, which shouldn't get lost, which is the personal, and is the absolute core of many relationship-based ways of working. And I think I just reproduced this partly because it links to work that's being done here in Cersei by Janet Boddy, colleagues, also Hélène Join-Lambert, about looking at different models across Europe. We have a very particularly strong split between the public and private. They are, for instance, working on ideas around social pedagogy, where some of the core principles are, for example, treating the child as a whole person rather than splitting off, saying to them there are things about you we don't want to know about, but also the practitioner seeing themselves as a person who's in relationship, and children and staff as inhabiting the same life space, not existing in separate hierarchical domains. Which is certainly not what most e-safety approaches would allow for. So the final point in terms of is I just wanted to mention the work of Andrew Hope, who's a researcher who's done a great deal of really interesting work and the way in which technologies are transforming what schools are and what they do. And he argues we're failing to have a proper debate about children online, and that's subverted by 4 factors. First of all, the way we construct e-kids, the way that children are constructed as vulnerable in this debate. The muting of young people's voices. the responsibilisation of young people, saying that privacy and learning how to control privacy is for all of us our personal business. And finally, a kind of diagnostic inflation around risk, which is really, going back to the Sonia Livingston's point, which is that the really serious risk is a relatively small group of young people who were vulnerable anyway before they went online. I want to show you two things. I don't know how much time I've got. Am I okay for time? Okay, well, I'm going to show you first something. Sorry, I'm going behind. Actually, no, I'll show you this first because I'm going to show you both of them, but I have to do it under here. Yeah. Apologies.
Welcome to this documentary. This documentary looks at the advantages and disadvantages of using online gaming and social media.
I don't like them because it stops people from talking to each other, communicating.
I find it difficult to think of any advantages. Facebook, Twitter, I have no time for. I don't use them in my personal life. I'd rather not have to have use of them in my professional life.
I use Facebook as my main social networking site, and that's where I check on my friends and family and look at their posts and what they're up to. Twitter I use for my educational interests, to see what other teachers are saying and keep up with the educational developments.
What I find interesting is that people seem to fight it, and I think that's really bad. Don't think people should fight it. They should accept it and try and use them in the best possible way, especially in schools and things like that. Use them to their advantage.
Okay. I think we'll leave it with Mr. Steele then as the first head. So thank you very much.